Part 2 of Chapter 3 of Love's Next Door. Justin paced back and forth across the floor of his living room. He had been home for over an hour, and was now more irritated than he was when he arrived. After leaving the restaurant, he and Cheryl continued their rip-roaring fight. He had never seen her so mad, going on and on about Stacy this and Stacy that, until finally he told her she was being childish and he wouldn't listen to it anymore. Big mistake. Cheryl launched into yet another tirade. There was a few things about Cheryl that bothered Justin, and it became painfully obvious as the evening wore on. The most annoying thing about her was her vicious temper and lack of understanding. He tried to apologize, but she refused to listen. He agreed that Stacy had gone overboard, but that was no reason for Cheryl to go on like a raving lunatic. Also, the way Cheryl tried to control and manipulate him was beginning to irritate him. If there was one thing he couldn't stand, it was a control freak. After they had argued in the car for over an hour, Justin had driven Cheryl home and dropped her off, speeding away without bothering to kiss her goodnight as she slammed her way out of the car. His thoughts turned to Stacy. There was that moment when he held Stacy in his arms and felt his heart race. Justin had never before experienced that feeling with Stacy. He also could not rid himself of the thought of her firm breasts pushing against his chest, or how her curvaceous body fit perfectly against his as they floated slowly across the dance floor. His emotions still reeling with confusion, he placed his hand where Stacy had brushed her lips on his neck, against his neck. That was close. For a moment on the dance floor, he had almost given in to temptation. He wanted so desperately to kiss her. Damn her, he cursed out loud. He continued to pace the floor, trying to interpret his feelings. Then he began to feel guilty. If his love for Cheryl was so solid, why did he react so strongly to Stacy? Why did it feel so good to draw her body close to his, and why did it feel so familiar, so comfortable, so right? Maybe he needed some fresh air to clear his mind. He walked into the kitchen and made some coffee, pouring the warm liquid into a large thermos mug. His thoughts were elsewhere as he pressed the lid tightly into place. After pulling on his boots, coat, and gloves, he opened the door and slammed it shut behind him, entering into the cold, dark, wintry evening. It was snowing again, not heavily, just soft, white snowflakes that danced and sparkled in the air as they floated to the ground. Taking the shovel in his hands, he walked across the back of the house and started to clear away the snow that Stacy had piled at the back door. His face broke into a grin. He had to admit, when all was said and done, it was a funny prank. He finished clearing the back steps and felt good about having worked through some of his frustration. Then he began to make his way towards the front of the house. Through the clearing, he watched the figure of a woman walking towards him. Laying the shovel aside, he uncapped his coffee and took a deep swallow, letting the warm liquid heat his insides, displacing the chill. Shortly after arriving home from dinner, Stacy pulled a bottle of mineral water from the fridge and tried to edit the manuscript she had started earlier, but after an hour she laid the papers aside. She was reading the same line over and over again and not seeing the words. She paced around the house, feeling alert and awake, which surprised her because an evening with Lizzie was a sure cure for insomnia. She stood in front of the kitchen window, thinking about her reaction to Justin. A shiver ran through her body as she remembered his voice imploring her to stop moving her lips against his neck. She never really thought of his voice as being sexy. Annoying, maybe, but definitely not sexy. But sexy it was, and laced with passion, when he whispered into her ear on the dance floor. As she let the scene unfold in her mind, it brought a rush of desire that centered somewhere below her stomach. It was time for either a cold shower or a long walk. She moved towards the door and quickly threw on her coat and boots to go for a walk that she knew would lead her down the street where Justin lived. She wasn't sure if he'd be home or cared to see her after the stunt she pulled at the restaurant. The cool night air helped energize Stacy as she moved toward the form that stood illuminated by the porch light. She had not expected Justin to be outside as she drew nearer. The tension was evident. He turned and glared angrily at Stacy as Stacy approached. For a moment, as she came closer, she thought about turning around and running home. She couldn't bear it if Justin was so angry with her that he ended their friendship, and she was sure that fear showed on her face. She avoided his eyes and looked around the yard. "So what's going on?" she asked, still not looking at him. Justin chose his words carefully. The wounds were still fresh from the exchange with Cheryl. good question, he said slowly. But how do I answer it? That's the real question. He looked around the yard, then glanced down at the ground before raising his head to look at Stacy. Her head was lower as she dug into the snow with the toe of her boot, not wanting to be caught staring into his spellbound eyes. Finally, Stacy looked up and met his gaze, and for a moment she sensed the same electric emotion that he tried so hard to conceal during the dance. I see you finally got around to shoveling the snow, she said, trying to ease the tension. Yep, was all he said as he capped his thermos and walked towards the end of the driveway, leaving her standing alone. Stacy watched him move away, and then something sprang from inside, and her bravado came rushing back like the storm in the night. She squared her shoulders and marched over to him. He knew she would follow him. She was like an annoying fly, buzzing around his head. Shoo her away, but eventually she will come back to pester you once again. Justin, are you mad at me for some reason? She asked. She questioned him. Now why would I be mad at you? I don't know, she answered. You tell me. What was going on at the restaurant? He asked, as he dug his shovel into the snow and flung its contents towards the road. What, the dance? Or the dirty looks I was getting from Cheryl? She was becoming deliberately obnoxious, and his frustration was becoming increasingly apparent. Come on, Stacy, stop trying to be funny and answer the question. What was going on when you asked me to dance? Hold on, let me rephrase that. What was going on when we were dancing? He stopped shoveling for a moment and looked at her, surveying her curvaceous frame, picture perfect, and her straight brown hair peeking from behind her hat. She was standing there shuffling her feet in the snow. Stacy stopped fidgeting and peered at him as she considered being evasive again. Her better judgment prevailed, and she decided to tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made her feel. She took a deep breath. I don't know, but while we were dancing, I felt something. Yeah, you knew you felt the need to stir up trouble, he said, trying to ignore the message she was sending. Well, yes, that too, Justin. I'm really sorry if I caused problems between you and Cheryl. Blame it on a few drinks. But I felt this kind of attraction for you when we were dancing, and that confused me. I mean, think about it. You must admit it's rather strange. Well, thanks a lot. He dropped his shovel and marched over to where she was standing. You find me unattractive? A bozo, maybe? She started to laugh at him. She had hurt his feelings, and it was obvious. Oops, Justin, I didn't mean it like that, she said, laughing harder. Justin leaned over, and all in one motion, picked up some snow, formed a snowball, and heaved it at Stacy. It hit her square in the face. The laughter died. Stacy reached out and clenched the snow from her forehead, and slowly bent over, reaching for a handful of snow. Stacy, he said, warning her, it was an accident. I didn't mean to hit you in the face. The anger was forgotten now. Accident my foot, she said, piling the snow higher in her hand. I wouldn't do it if I were you. Then he took off in a sprint, running as fast as he could around the corner of the house. Not to be outdone, Stacy followed in hot pursuit with 2 handfuls of snow. Justin, now it's my turn, she yelled in the night. She rounded the corner of the house. Stacy couldn't see a thing in the darkness that covered the backyard like a blanket. Cautiously, she took another step, careful not to make any noise. Laughter erupted from the darkness as Justin attacked Stacy once more. This time a snowball hit her in the back. She fell face first in the snow and laid still. Slowly, a devilish smile spread across her face as she gradually began to wheeze. For a few seconds, Justin listened to her laboring breathing before fear replaced his amusement. He found Stacy lying face down in the snow next to the back steps. She was barely breathing. Oh, God, I'm so sorry, Stacy, he said, rolling her on her back. She kept her eyes closed as he leaned over and put his ear to her chest. The seconds seemed like minutes. She waited until he was positioned exactly where she wanted him, and then she clamped her legs around him and flipped him on his back. Stacy was left conveniently perched on top of Justin. A victorious grin graced her face. Arg, I flipped you like a cheese omelet, she said triumphantly. I've got you now, and then began to shove snow down his neck while he frantically tried to push her away. Justin seemed genuinely stunned by her new-found life and his sudden predicament. Stacy, enough, he yelled at her. That was a dirty trick, he said, laughing while trying to brush the snow out of his collar. She leaned over until their noses touched. Are you cold? She taunted, still refusing to budge from atop her throne. The melting snow was now beginning to flow down around his chest, but its iciness did nothing to quench the fire that was developing. Phew. He didn't say a word, just looked into her sparkling hazel eyes. He leaned slightly upwards and brought their lips together. Her eyes widened in surprise as the same excitement she'd experienced earlier at the dance floor flowed through her body. Stacy closed her eyes and let the kiss happen. That's the end of chapter 3. Dun dun dun!